Let's now talk about IELTS listening and look at the structure of the test. And one thing we know about the IELTS listening test is that it is the same for the academic and general training. So if you're doing the academic IELTS or general IELTS, it's exactly the same test. Also, if you're doing paper-based or computer-generated, it's exactly the same test. It's the same structure. It's the same type of questions that you're expected to answer. So how does it look? Well, there are 4 different sections of the listening test. And in the first section, you have a person who is giving information and you have someone who's receiving information. So you have 2 speakers. And these 2 speakers, they'll be interacting in some way. So often you have a buyer and a seller, or you might have somebody who's calling up to make a booking and somebody who's making the reservation for them. You might have someone who is talking about some information and somebody who's trying to inquire about that information. So you've got this interaction between the 2 speakers. So you're always thinking that someone is an expert and then someone is trying to get the information from that expert. There's 2 speakers, as we said. There's 10 questions overall. And like all of the different parts of or different sections of IELTS, we have these different question types. So we've got multiple choice, we've got matching, we've got short answer, we've got summary completion, diagram labeling, completing notes. We might have charts and tables and forms and sentences. So these are the types of questions that we have. And in many ways, it's similar to the reading test. Some of the questions actually look similar to what you might find on IELTS reading. The skills that we have for all 4 sections, well, we're talking about listening for context. So what is the context? Is it a buying and selling context? Is it a providing information? Is it maybe a radio talk? Is it an academic talk? These are the things we've got to try and think about. You've got to think about not just the context, which is a larger picture, but you've got to look at the small picture. What are the details? What are the numbers? What are the names? What's the spelling? What's the phone number? These types of details that you'll need to write down. Understanding opinions. So what are different people thinking? What are the perspectives of the different speakers? Of course, spelling is important because when you listen, you've got to write down the word that you hear. So when you write it down, you must have accurate spelling. On IELTS, it's pretty harsh. If you don't have the correct spelling, 0. You don't get a mark for that particular question. So it's really important that your spelling is accurate. And of course, vocabulary. And when we talk about vocabulary, the skills in vocabulary for listening are to do with synonyms. So if you have one word that you hear and then one word that you can see on the script, on the question sheet, can you match those 2? Can you make sure that there is a match so that you can actually answer the question correctly by knowing what they're talking about? So like we said, in section 1, we've got a giver of information and we've got a receiver of information. In section 2, there's an information talk. So somebody, as we can see here, just one speaker will talk for quite a long time on a particular topic, and there'll be 10 questions associated with that. The third part is a education conversation, and it might be between 2 students talking. So for example, 2 students might be talking about an upcoming exam that they have, or maybe an assessment or an essay they have to write. And again, one person who's speaking normally has more information and the other person's trying to get the information from that person. You might even have a conversation between a teacher and a student, or a tutor and a student, but it's always has a academic focus, and that's even for the general test as well. Okay, so as we know, the general and the academic are the same, so we still have that education focus. The part 4 is the most challenging. So the part 4 is an area where students often find that their questions are difficult. Okay, they're challenging, they're hard, and often it's because the language is quite complex. You've got advanced English and quite specific English. So you might have something about biology, or you might have something about architecture, or you might have something about physics or economics. So it's a very specific piece of language which is going on here in the lecture. And again, you've got one speaker, so we can see a bit of a pattern. Section 1 and section 3, you have multiple speakers, and section 2 and section 4, you just have that one speaker, and you've got to listen carefully and answer those questions. So, who are you speaking to? Again, section 1, a conversation between two people. This is so important. It's so important because if you know who you're listening to, if you know the types of conversations, you can be prepared. You know, at section 1, there's going to be two people, and this might be about buying or selling, completing an application form, making a booking, finding out about an upcoming event. So it's key that you are ready for that listening, that you know what you're going to be listening to. Section 2 is a talk by one person about a general topic. As we've said, might be a radio program, could be a tour guide, and it might even be a person, an expert talking about a product or a service. Section 3, again, is a conversation between students or university professors in which they discuss an academic situation, assignment, task, research paper. So when you know it's section 3, you've got to be ready for that academic environment, that academic context. And section 4 again is academic, which we have a lecture given by one speaker who has a great deal of knowledge about a topic. So this often involves a professor at a university, some other higher education institution, talking about a topic, biology, history, economics. Again, it's complex, it's challenging, it's hard to listen to sometimes, it's hard to stay up with the speaker. We generally say that this is the easiest part, section 1, and then section 2 a little bit more tricky, and then by the time we get to section 4, it's quite challenging. So again, you need to do a lot of practice, do some practice tests, listen out for your synonyms, make sure you have good vocabulary, and spelling as well is another important point that we've mentioned. So there you go, there's an overview of the IELTS listening test.